during the recent G7 summit in Italy, unlike other members, US President Donald Trump expressed his continued opposition to the Paris Climate Agreement. He said he would decide this week whether the US is going to withdraw from the climate change deal. Trump criticized Germany for dumping vehicles on the US market, calling his German allies very bad. What will be his next move to deal with the trade deficit with Germany, and how will Germany respond? While meeting with the NATO member state leaders, Trump once again publicly expressed his dissatisfaction about the contribution of 23 member states providing less than the 2% GDP guideline.
23 of the 28 member nations are still not paying what they should be paying and what they are supposed to be paying for their defense. This is not fair to the people and taxpayers of the United States.
What impact will Trump's views have on the future of NATO? Following the G7 meeting, German Chancellor Angela Merkel stated that Europe should no longer depend on the US and UK and must become more independent. What kind of new identity will Europe seek in depending less on outside support?
After the G7 meeting in Italy, US President Donald Trump continues to generate headlines from his first overseas trip. His intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement and demanding for payment from NATO members leaves his European allies in a dilemma. Will the world's biggest economy stay in the Paris deal? What effect will Trump's complaints have on NATO? And where are US-EU relations heading in this era of uncertainty? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Anna Tangen, author and columnist, and Michela Garatti, head of China Economic Policy Program of the Nottingham University Business School in China. We shall also speak to Fraser Cameron, director of the EU Asia Center, via telephone. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Top concern for leaders from around the world, not just for those of G7, I'm afraid, is whether the United States is beating a retreat from the climate change agreement that was reached between the United States and China. What do you think will be the most possible prospects?
Well, at this point, Donald Trump is mulling over withdrawing from it or renegotiating it. I don't think the renegotiation channel is one that can be actively sustained. I think it was quite clear that it was all votes against one, the United States, when he came here.
Do you have any alternative truth to the Paris Agreement?
I'm not Trump, so I'll try to say the real truth. The agreement, like you just said, it was hard to get, and let's remember the US was one of the countries that was always reluctant to sign any of such agreements. So putting back into discussion is basically status quo, a pre-Trump or even pre-Obama and pre-Clinton's ages. So the point is, these agreements are very tough to be implemented, because then we have external shocks that change the situation, and every country goes back to look after their own interests. So in the face of having made such a big agreement like in Paris, and China played a very important role, at the end of the day, internal and domestic problem dominates the arena, and in fact, some people may even argue that China's strong emphasis on the Paris Agreement was mostly dominated by internal domestic reasons, for example, the restructuring of the supply of energy in China and so on, which played very well. Domestic and international goals together, and then China plays a very nice role in Paris.
Given the strong defiance of President Trump about the climate change deal, what do you think of the image that he has erected during his trip, the first of its kind, to Europe after winning the presidency?
Well, of course, it depends on your perspective. There are those in the United States.
He brushed aside the Prime Minister from Montenegro for a group photo, and that was very bad for the perception of the American image.
Well, in his image personally, he's known as a playground bully. This simply enhanced that. On the other hand, those who support him say, oh yes, he's really showing everybody that the United States is on top. I tend to be of the first camp. I don't think this kind of behavior is very diplomatic or shows the U.S. in a good light. Nor did the handshake with Macron, where he was obviously trying to muscle him over things. This kind of bullying behavior is not maybe more appropriate on the playground when you're 11 or 12, but not from a grown man who's supposedly trying to lead the world.
So he doesn't look like a president. Do you think he will grow up? He will look more presidential as the learning curve could take much longer time for this president.
Perhaps longer than his tenure as president, we'll see. But Trump has always been like this. I had the honor to meet him many, many years ago when he came to my school to give a talk and we exchanged views. And I almost have to say it probably hasn't changed much in terms of behavior. Very, in a way, abrupt, direct. Some people may like it, some people may not like it, but you know, I don't vote for US presidential, so I don't need to support one or the other one because my voice doesn't count. But he's not the first and he's not going to be the last president that behaves in a unfashionable manner. We had this around Europe, Latin America,
Despite
Asia,
the fact that the United States remains the sole superpower with the end of the Cold War, the world seems to be more hungry for new leadership following the maneuvers by President Trump, either on the campaign trail or in his recent twitters that he's going to be retreat from globalization, he's against globalization, he will renegotiate NAFTA, renegotiate climate change, be absent from TPP. Now, if you look at these series of punches from President Trump, do you think China will have to be will be pushed to the forefront and assume the leadership? Do you think China is ready?
Yeah, I don't think it's being pushed as much as pulled in because of the vacuum that Donald Trump is creating. This whole idea that he doesn't like any organization which is not solely controlled by the United States, this kind of what we've talked about before, this wheel type of thing with the U.S. at the center and all the spokes representing individual deals where the U.S. can use its military and economic might to get better deals. This is not working. And in fact, if he was trying to do this, he's failed utterly. Because what has happened now and emerged from his trip is a stronger EU. I mean, you had Merkel coming out and saying, we are on our own. We cannot rely on England and we cannot rely on the United States. Macron has also emerged. It's quite clear that now, from now on, EU, it will take say what is best for EU, because America is certainly doing what's best for America.
Well, given the growing split between the two sides across the Atlantic Ocean, if you look at the handshake between Merkel and Emmanuel Macron, the first of his overseas trip by the French president, the newly elected one. If you look at the latest meeting between Putin and Emmanuel Macron on the doorsteps of the presidential palace in Paris, now it seems that G7 itself is in trouble. And do you think G20 will instead replace this mechanism in reshaping and rebuilding the flawed world economic order?
Well, the G7 is a little bit in trouble. I have to say also, since it was held in near my hometown in Sicily, we followed quite closely. It was a bit of an unfortunate timing squeezed in between the Silk Road Forum and the G20 in Germany. Obviously, Germany being a strong power in Europe, they would have had no interest in making this G7 particularly successful and give credit to the Italian presidency. So this was a tactical meeting where nothing was really done, and so all things are now moved into Germany, where Merkel can get a little bit more credit. The last thing that Merkel would like to have seen is to get credit to the Italian Prime Minister for making steps in the G7. In fact, when you just mentioned Merkel said we are on our own, it's not clear whether she means me on my own, me, my country on my own, or me, Europe on our own. And there are different layers of isolation, and we know that the question that Europe needs to face is Germany going to become a European, or is Europe going to become Germanized?
Well,
big question.
I think this is, obviously there are issues between Italy and Germany, especially over the debt repayment and things like this. I think it's very clear that Merkel has been the de facto leader of things, although reluctantly. Now she has perhaps a potential partner in Macron if he's able to change France. I don't think it's a necessity of making the EU into Germany. I don't think that is possible. I think the majority of EU opinion, including what you just expressed, would prevent that. But quite frankly, the difference, the chasm that's opening up is between the US and Europe. Two competitors. Remember, each one does exactly what the other one does. In terms of airplanes, technology, machinery, they are the true competition. And this is where this is going to end up, unfortunately.
Let me cross over to Fraser Cameron for his comments on the latest development concerning the G7 meeting, as well as image and behavior of President Trump, who is undergoing the first overseas trip after winning the presidency. Hello, Fraser. What do you think of the G7 platform? Do you think it still matters as much as it did when G20 promises to be a new platform for addressing rebuilding of the world economic order?
Well, yes, it has worked in the past. The question is, will it continue to work with the Trump administration? This was the first time you saw Trump at a G7 meeting, and he seemed very ill-prepared, and his team were unable to come up in advance with any points on the agenda, were not interested in making any compromise. So,
but what do you think are the major issues on the agenda between President Trump and other members of G7? Do you think he still enjoys the leadership? Do you think President Trump is still trusted by fellows on the G7 platform?
No, he's not. I mean, there's no American leadership on trade, there's no American leadership on climate change, and in terms of globalization, the Americans under Trump have a very different agenda. So this is really a watershed moment for the G7.
Okay, thank you, thank you so much. I'll get back to you, Fraser, for more comments on the relationship between Europeans and the United States. But what do you think of the economic, the very tricky economic relationship between Berlin and Washington? Since President Trump accused Germany of stealing American jobs,
being bad,
threatening to slap punitive tariffs on German products. However, BMW created 5,000 jobs in the United States instead of any other places. So what do you think of the complaints by your president?
Well, my president, good or bad, I think.
You didn't vote for him, did you?
No, I did not. Quite frankly, I mean, it's as Fraser was saying, it's not clear. People are puzzled. He's attacking groups who actually have interests within the United States. What does this mean? No one understands it, and I don't think his administration. I think he's trying to make points. He's desperate to change the conversation in Washington, which seems to be all about his ongoing controversies, connections to Russia, etc. There's also these security leaks. When you ask, do the Europeans trust him, I think the Israelis will have second thoughts about giving him actionable intel when he decided to share it with the Russians. I think May has a lot of questions about what happened and how it was possible that the U.S. Secret Services were able to divulge very sensitive information about the whole situation in Manchester. These continuing slip-ups and inability to understand even basic concepts, for instance, the EU. He kept struggling to understand that Brussels and Germany had the same policy towards things. There was not a different trade policy or set of tariffs between them. These types of things are really beginning to set in and bother most of the Europeans and I think most of the world.
Let me go back to the issue of automobiles and the auto market. Michaela, some believe that the lack of competitiveness of the U.S. auto brands needs to be considered instead of blaming other economies. What is your opinion? Do you believe Trump's protectionism could revitalize the U.S. auto industry?
I think it could. Let's say if it doesn't, it probably won't happen. If he doesn't close the doors a little bit, I would say the industry may suffer a lot. We know very well, we are in China, we know what happens here, we know in Vietnam, Bangladesh and other production facilities much cheaper than the United States, including transport costs and efficiency. Basically the auto industry is in trouble, and not just the auto industry. So the question is, it's a very philosophical question in a way. if you lower barriers and you have a free trade or semi-free trade, it's good for the economy of both parties, on average. Within the average, there are winners and losers. So the leader of a country needs to decide what is his goal. Is his goal to increase the average wealth of the country, or is the goal is to target a subgroup of the country? May not believe what he says, but at least his narrative is the forgotten shall not be forgotten anymore. So workers, low-end people who voted for him. By the way, I never met anyone that voted for Trump. It's unclear how he got to 50% or 48% of the votes. But if he raises barriers for the short term, we have to be honest, he may have, not because he's Trump, but sometimes they can have a positive effect on kicking off some particularly badly affected strata of the economy. And China, which is the only country that can deploy overnight capital, people, raw materials, and know-how to build infrastructure, where China has almost the best infrastructure in the world, is probably the ideal partner. And I think the game that Trump is playing is make it sure that on the trade things get a bit tough, but on the investment side, on inbound investment into the United States, things get a bit more open. And that's what the US needs. The US doesn't need trade, doesn't need to buy goods from abroad, or it can suffer with higher prices if we were to close the door, but it needs capital, it needs infrastructure development in the Midwest.
I couldn't disagree more. I'm going to present the opposite side. The U.S. still exports $2 trillion worth of goods. Without that, its economy would literally collapse. I was chairman of the States of Wisconsin's International Trade Council.
Including arms sales to Saudi Arabia?
Arms sales to Saudi Arabia, I guess that just went up a notch. But quite frankly, this idea that somehow the American companies will prosper, I find very difficult to believe. These are international car companies. The automatic things, when you erect a barrier, the other side erects a barrier. This will ruin their business. It is anti-globalization. It will try to turn back the hands of the clock on everything that has been done so far. The U.S. is not in a position to start a trade war because of its dependence on its own exports. So I really don't see how this Trump's move even mirrors reality in any kind of way, shape, or form.
If I may, we don't have to go to the extreme to close everything or to knock off $2 trillion of trade, but targeted. You want to make auto parts, you want to give Detroit a little bit boost in some, then you do a bit of trade on some part manufacturing. China has grown at 10% per year for 40 years, and it's close to investment. There are import tariffs on all sorts of goods. And it still has $1 trillion of exports. So I don't know if the relation between tariffs and depending on how tactically these tariffs are applied to each goods.
Let me go to Fraser Cameron for his comments on the issue of automobile industry between the two sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Fraser, are you with us?
Yes, I mean, the American car industry has actually been doing rather well lately, as has the American economy. This is one of the strange things when Trump is going on about how terrible things are. And the American economy has been growing, 3-4%. Many countries in Europe will be very happy about that. But as the previous speaker said, a lot of European companies, particularly German companies, have plants in the United States and produce very cost-efficient products and help bring jobs to deprived parts of the United States, like Alabama and the Carolinas. So I think basically Trump's economics and his economic advisors really have to have a rethink, because there is no such thing as a national approach to international car manufacturing today.
I would echo that. I mean, you start looking, Germany is nothing. Start looking at the amount of plants and cars that are produced by Japanese car makers in the United States. They're the number one things. The issue is American car companies need to be more competitive. They're already being beat at home by the Germans and the Japanese, by who are putting out cars that Americans prefer. The issue is the marketplace.
You're right.
Not protections.
After all, President Trump wins the presidency on the platform of populism and trade protectionism, putting America first. That's the campaign slogan. You are watching Dialogue with Anna Tangen, Michele Geraci, and Fraser Cameron. We're discussing why, against the backdrop of trade protectionism and deglobalization, Donald Trump made this overseas trip, the first of its kind outside the United States, and why there have been so much tough quarrels and debates within and among members of the G7 bloc, a club of the 7 most developed economies of the world. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. Well, the issue of NATO. Now, your president, Donald Trump, oh, you didn't vote for him, by the way. He insisted
Still my
that
president.
Other allies of NATO should share the defense spending, accounting for 2% of their GDP individually. What do you think of the feasibility?
Well, I think most nations have done it, but let's get down to this fuzzy thinking that he has. He tweeted after he got back to the United States that the accounts are, the money is rolling into the accounts. This is absurd. The whole point is NATO is a voluntary. 2% is a target. And all the expenditures of that 2% are by the country. It does not go into one shared account, all right? So this idea that he's trying to project that somehow all the money's coming in and the U.S. is getting paid back for all of its expenditures it's just a blatant misinformation campaign. And it's amazing that he would be using that when something that is so transparent and obvious. So in terms of NATO, he's decided for one reason or another that he wants to minimize it. He wants the U.S. to take the lead role, but he wants them to contribute. But how you can contribute when you don't like your partner, when your partner is constantly berating you and spreading misinformation?
And we have no money.
Well, Italy is one of the member states of the NATO. Do you think NATO still matters since...
It's a little bit less than it was before.
Will it need more reforms, profound reforms, so that its functions, both military and political, can be sustained?
We know the threats have evolved. We're not going to be attacked by the Russians. There's no Cold War. In fact, the Russians may not be as bad as...
I'm afraid the three Balkan states, Lithuania, Estonia, for example, they are afraid of being bullied by Russians.
True, so is South Korea, but North Korea, there's regional things more than geo-global stuff. I mean, but yeah, there will be some scope, of course, for the NATO to continue to be maybe retargeted, but we know the threats now come from other places. And I was saying maybe Russia is not as bad as we thought it was. Maybe some good guys are the bad guys. Rethinking of the NATO is important. The thing, like you said, is like the money and the budget is a little bit used to domestic narrative and maybe try to pretend that there is some saving from the attitude while there isn't.
The issue is whether NATO is facing a single and common enemy.
No, NATO doesn't have a purpose. Its sole purpose was to create an anti-Russian thing. Now, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, it's been searching. Why are you spending money on something that's irrelevant? Yes, if there is a threat from Russia, it can be solved through nuclear deterrent. But spending all of this money and then trying to find a purpose for it, retasking it to terrorism, it sounds fine, but is the expenditure on NATO actually doing anything to combat terrorism, and can it? There's an argument that the barrel of a gun will not kill the idea, that what is needed is a better idea. And that is not something NATO is going to do.
Well, it's very difficult to examine and figure out why the eastward expansion of NATO in the early 1990s has really angered Russians. It seems to have betrayed earlier promise by the NATO not to have not to undertake any serious expansion. Having said this, Anna and Michaela, what do you think of the alleged vows by Angela Merkel to rely on self-defense of the European Union itself instead of turning to NATO, instead of betting the future of the European Union on the United States and the United Kingdom following the Brexit?
Well, I think she's looking out, quite frankly, for the interests. NATO, as everyone agrees, has no real purpose. It's trying to be repurposed, as we said, towards terrorism, things like that. And this is she's simply reflecting the reality of what's there.
What do you think of the European Union strengthening its own defense instead of relying on NATO?
Totally.
In fact, this debate was held during the Bosnia-Herzegovina war, when President Clinton was very reluctant to commit any ground troops. Instead of a turn to air campaign to beleaguer, descend in on Belgrade. The air campaign led to the ouster of Milosevic.
The idea, there's floating around the idea of a European army or stuff like that, which in my view is completely out of the reality. There is no one I know in Europe that would wake up in the morning, take a rifle and fight for Europe. We don't have this anymore. We have the real purpose of one of the main purposes of the European Union is to forget the concept of country borders, to go beyond the damages that we have done in the last century. It's to create a community of people that don't feel French, Italian, Spanish, Germans anymore. And in fact, it's something that should also have embedded the idea that it could continue to expand and include more and more countries. That if the European Union were to say this is the border between Poland and Russia and that's it would be a failure. The European Union should be a seed for a peaceful, as it has been in the last 50 years in Central Europe, of a community of people that exchange trades, people, students, and so on, but no borders. The fact of having a line that says this is European Union, this is not, is almost against the very idea of the European Union. And I know you have to have borders, like you said, that may expand, but and you have to have them to make it practical. But the idea is that you want to have an inclusive participation. You should welcome at various stages and various levels of cooperation, everyone. But the army, I don't know who gets this idea and where they get it from.
Okay, frankly, I think there are people in Ukraine who might have a little objection to your idea that there are no borders and things like that. Obviously, when you have situations where Russia feels, and rightly so, that they were betrayed, because there was an oral promise made that neither NATO nor the EU would go into these Balkan states. Now, whether they had the legitimate authority to make those kinds of decisions about other countries that they're not in is another issue. From the Russian point of view, promises were broken, and they have reacted quite seriously towards it. But this idea of the army, I think, is a canard. It is a way of simply saying we should be examining whether NATO fills its duels. And it might be over. The U.S., Donald Trump, refused to put in Article 5 or mention that he was this idea that there would be a common defense. Attack one, you attack all. He's even put it on the table and said, I'll have to think about it. This is unheard of. He's attacking the very fundamentals of where NATO was begun. So at this point, yes, I disagree with my learned colleague. I say that you should be re-examining other alternatives. I agree.
Do you agree on the army?
Yes, no one's going to pick up a rifle and fight for the EU. But on the other hand, something needs to be done. NATO is not filling the gap.
Yes, Ukraine and Russia should be part of the policy debates that are going on within the European Union, and of course across the Atlantic Ocean. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.